is going to provide an overview of data management and sharing plans. We're going to cover what they are, what types of data are addressed in a DMSP, and how to describe, store, and share your data, and how to budget for data sharing. So the first thing we should talk about is, why do we need a DSMP? Well, we need to have a DMSP because NIH has said that there is a policy of data management sharing, which is effective January 25th, 2023. And since we're almost into 2023, we need to make sure that we create data management sharing plans. Data management sharing plans follow the FAIR data principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Your data needs to be accessible by the time of your first publication or the end of the performance period of the grant. So it's important to get this set up in place and ready to go by either of those two deadlines. And it also needs to comply with the awardee's plan, which will be approved by the funding institute or center. So looking at the definition of research data, scientific data, essentially are recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community to document and support research findings. It's any digital information in any format. So there's a wide range of things that are considered scientific data. It can be generated by any types of means, including but not limited by observation, computation, or experiment. Scientific data, however, do not include summary statistics or tables, lab notebooks, partial data sets, preliminary analyses, drafts of scientific paper, plans for future research, peer review reports or comments, communications with colleagues, or physical objects. Scientific data, in short, means data on which the summary statistics and tables are based. So now that we've defined scientific data, exactly what does the DMSP entail? Basically, a data management sharing plan outlines what you will do with your data during and after an NIH-funded research project. To do that, you must identify the data types and resources you'll be generating from your research. We propose a timeline for when the data and resources will be available. You also determine at what type of repository the data will be stored. And finally, you describe how the data can be accessed by the user, and if the data are open source or if there are restrictions on their use. It sounds complicated, but there's a lot of assistance and information in writing a DMSP. The first step is to read the FOA. The funding opportunity announcement provides the data sharing expectations with that particular agency issuing the FOA. Most FOAs specify the types of data that should be shared, the expectations for the timing of the data release, and the recommended sharing repositories. The supplemental information in the DMS policy includes details and allowable costs associated with data management and sharing. And you need to make sure that you build this into your budget in your grant proposal for those costs, which will include data curation, storage, maintenance, and hosting. Prior to issuing an award, the funder will review your plan to ensure it meets expectations and, when necessary, request modifications. The funder also reviews your DMSP plan compliance annually as a consideration for approving continued funding. So the elements of the DMSP, there are essentially 9 elements. Elements 1 to 3 center on describing the data collection procedures, the tools, software, or codes that are needed to read and use the data, and selecting a metadata standard to define how the data will be organized and documented. Elements 4 through 6 ensure how the data quality will be handled, the preservation strategy, and the type of repository you will use. They also include access and policies timeline for how long the data will be available. And elements 7 through 9 essentially focus on dissemination and data use, responsibility, and paying for the upkeep of the data during its lifetime. So in this section, we're going to talk about products, format, and metadata, so more about data. So what you need to address regarding data types, amounts, and formats. NIH does not expect that researchers will preserve and share all scientific data generated in a study. It is up to you to determine what type of data, how much of that data, and the amount and size of the scientific data expected to be collected and used in the project. Your funder, again, will review your DNSP, make recommendations for you to follow. A simple summary statement, something along the lines of, we will be collecting 256 channel EEG data and fMRI images from approximately 50 research participants, addresses the modality of the data, imaging, the level of aggregation, whether it's individual aggregated or summarized, and or the degree of data processing, how raw or processed the data will be. Then you simply provide a description of which data will be preserved and shared from those 50 participants. You also address any ethical, legal, and technical factors that may affect the extent to which the data are preserved and shared. So you want to list the relevant data and any associated documentation, such as study protocols or data collection instruments, that were made accessible to facilitate interpretation of your data. And every step of the way, provide the rationale for why you're making these decisions. And you may ask, why am I taking the time again to do this? Well, first, the granting agency wants other researchers to know what you have collected or will collect. Second, the granting agency wants to know how you will manage your data. And lastly, it wants other researchers to be able to find, access, and use your data. So to meet those three requirements, you need to create metadata. And metadata is essentially data about data. It's used as a discovery tool. That's kind of like how things are found by search engines. Metadata defines content, interoperability concerns, access and transfer requirements. It situates the data as to a specific time and place and certifies that the data set and the version the user found is the authoritative data set of your research. Metadata also shows whether the data is current, available, archived, or no longer available, and it also addresses rights management, as in who has the right to view, share, use, and or repurpose the data. Metadata also provides additional descriptive and topical frames for data, which can range from very general to very specific descriptors, and topical information such as subject headings. For example, if the journals you plan to submit your research to are indexed in PubMed and PsycInfo, you might want to consider using the MESH and PsycInfo headings to tag your metadata. Because if they're already used to searching in PubMed and PsycInfo, they'll find it more easily when they go out to search for you on the internet. If there are specific ontologies for your discipline, such as GIS or social and behavioral, you might want to consider looking at those ontologies and using some of those terms and frames to make your data findable for other researchers in the field. You're also looking at very specific details that are necessary for others to use your data. You list your standards for the formats. You document why you selected these formats for metadata. Generally, they're an accepted domain standard. It has widespread usage. It could even be software generated. If your data set has no standards, will your project develop and maintain specific standards? You want to make sure how the metadata will be generated and document that, and what naming conventions you're going to use to describe your data. If you're using any kind of data dictionaries, taxonomies, or ontologies, list those. Are you going to version your data set? If you're going to version your data set, then what version control software will you be using? And then again, what tools are required to make use of your data sets, either software, instruments, etc. So that's kind of the general overview of thinking about metadata. But there are also a number of general questions you can ask yourself to help you get a handle on the data and the types of data. You want to list all the data you will generate during the project and the data you plan to share. In addition, you may have existing intermediary and final data sets that you may develop during the project, and you may choose to share all but one of them. And you can consider what kind of data you're collecting and how data described in your field. Quantitative social and economic data sets contain numerical data sets, geospatial data, or possibly spatial temporal data. Qualitative data can include microfilm, historical documents, oral interviews, videotapes, handwritten records, transcripts, etc. Just as with quantitative data, if you're going to use qualitative data, you need to de-identify transcripts. Experimental research is most likely tabulated data. So if your experimental data is using or comprised of mathematical and computer models, you need to include either a description of the models in your published articles, or to provide fully documented and robust versions of these models in with your data set, wherever you're archiving your data. Since your data may be comprised of multiple data types with multiple formats, the data formats, of course, affect access to and manipulation of the data. So you need to make sure that whatever formats you have are tied to software or hardware the user may need to view or generate data. So if it's instrument-specific formats of software, you put that in the SPSS, SAS, and Vivo, etc. The size or amount of data affects transmission, storage, analysis of the data. So again, if you're putting out a small data set, a terabyte of numerical data, versus running an experiment that requires 50 gig of RAM per each millisecond of transaction, those things need to be noted. Also, when you're determining what data will be preserved and shared, think carefully if there are any caveats on the use of your data. Will it be open access? Will permission be needed to access the site? How long will the data be stored? And these are the conversations you may need to have with IT if you plan to store locally at the university level, because server access and download capacity may be subject to some institutional restrictions. You may also need to accommodate changes in software as software versions up over time as well. Our next slide is simply a table of metadata elements and definitions that you may be using in the development of your metadata for your DMSP. Nothing to panic about, but it's very specific elements, so it's very nicely laid out. Then we also have very common metadata standards. Most metadata standards are compliant with the International Metadata Registry Standard, the ISO IEC 11179. That's very important. We have general and specialized metadata standards. The general ones like OASIS, OAIS, the accessible markup language, very ubiquitous, used all over the place. We also have specialist metadata standards that cover geospatial data, social and behavioral sciences data, and statistical data. The content standard for digital geospatial data is managed by the Federal Geographic Data Committee. The ICPSR is one of the oldest data repositories, academic repositories, and it's intended to help researchers document data sets and prepare them for archiving. Their site is a really good site. The 6th edition of their guide is an excellent, excellent resource. If you're looking at social or behavioral sciences, DDI is a good metadata specification, and it is very good for handling longitudinal data. So that might be a choice to look at if you're doing longitudinal studies. We also have the SDMX, which is primarily for time series data. It's not directly usable for survey microdata, but it's relevant for derived indicators. The U.S. Bureau of Label Statistics, for example, uses SDMX. So this is some common metadata standards, and there are others specific to disciplines and domains. Another important component that you will be creating for your metadata is citing your data set. It's the formal citation and acknowledgement, which are part of your metadata and are included in all manuscripts or other works published using your data. So if anyone uses your data for a paper they're writing or for another research project, they must cite and acknowledge. Those terms must be used to be able to use your data set. It's important to have a permanent uniform resource locator, a POL, that ensures if the data is moved to another area, it is always referred to the forwarding address. That's something you may want to set up also if you are doing something locally with IT. If your data is moved, the URL is changed, use restrictions apply or change, but the data is no longer available publicly, the acknowledgement protocols and citations must be updated to reflect those changes. So it's not a one-time only deal, it's something that needs to be managed over time. Our next section, we're going to talk about data storage, sharing, and archiving. Data storage is probably the most critical component of the project, especially when it comes to assuring the granting agency that the requirements for data sharing are met, or if an exemption is allowable. And this documentation is done for data, again, generated during and after the project is completed, as well as for the archive data. So during the project, we're going to document and keep current the following information: which data sets listed will not be stored or retained during the project, the type of media and location or locations where the data will be stored, and the responsible party who will be managing the storage and the archiving of that data, how and where the data will be backed up, and who's responsible, any access controls for data or data transfers that may need to be secured, and how these controls will be applied. Access controls can be something as simple as a password-protected network space for sensitive data, local passwords, single sign-on. You also want to after the project, post-project, you want to document and keep current which data sets used or generated or shared, which data sets are in proprietary formats, and if they'll be converted to a non-proprietary format for sharing. You want to determine the audience who will use your data sets. You want to determine the acknowledgement protocol so that anything is changed. The protocols and citations, again, are updated. You want to determine the sharing protocols, if they're open access or release upon request. If there's going to be any delay in the accessibility of your data after your research is done, you want to account for that in your data management sharing plan. You want to explain why and the details if you're going to embargo your data for a specific period. And you have the ability to embargo for a period of time for publication. You want to determine if the data is going to be shared under the auspices of the PI in a data archive, a data enclave, or a hybrid data share plan. And we'll talk more about this on the next slide. You want to determine how long the data will be kept beyond the life of the project. If a third-party service will be used to archive or release the data, and you want to set a release date to share your data. You're also going to describe any restrictions on use, sharing, and repurposing of your data sets. You can include the costs of any additional resources, such as a third-party service, in your budget. If a third party is going to archive or release data, then the services of that third party must be described and a formal archiving agreement created. For all university agreements, you might want to have general counsel involved. If you plan to make any or all of your data available through a Creative Commons license, you need to talk to your general counsel and to your program officer. The university and your funder may have certain protocols or requirements that must be met. You're also looking at avoiding confidentiality breaches. NIH strongly recommends researchers apply appropriate de-identification, establish scientific data sharing and use agreements, and understand and communicate the legal protections against data disclosure and misuse. And there are many methods currently being used to anonymize data. Items with low prevalence rates, which make it easier to identify participants with unusual characteristics, may have parts of the sample withheld or access to certain variables blocked. Other options include all these new methods that are coming out, such as synthetic data sets, which mimic the characteristics of the original data set, but don't risk identifying individual participants. Many different ways of avoiding confidentiality breaches, but you need to look at the data you're collecting and make sure that it is de-identified. And institutions and investigators should work closely together to make sure that the plans and procedures are appropriate to protect the confidentiality of the data. I strongly suggest looking at the additional NIH privacy guidance and patient data. And then we move to data sharing. Investigators can share under their own auspices, can impose appropriate limitations on users. So such an agreement usually indicates the criteria for data access, conditions for research use, and incorporates privacy and confidentiality standards to ensure data security at the recipient side. It also prohibits manipulation of data for the purposes of identifying subjects. Now, data archive is where machine-readable data are acquired, manipulated, documented, and distributed to the scientific community for further analysis. A data enclave is a controlled, secure environment in which eligible researchers can perform analyses using restricted data resources. So if you're looking at restricted data use, a data enclave will be your best choice. Databases that cannot be distributed to the general public because of participant confidentiality concerns, third-party licensing or use agreements that prohibit redistribution, or national security considerations, or those data sets accessed through a data enclave. Investigators may also wish to develop a mixed model or mixed mode for data sharing that allows more than one version of the data set to be shared with different levels of access provided depending upon the data. So you could provide a redacted data set for general use, but stricter controls through a data enclave if you had more sensitive data. At the end of the section, presentation, we have a list of data sharing sites for consideration. So when you're thinking about your data sharing plan, a simple description, such as how you can plan to share or not share your data. So example one offers a clear rationale why researchers would not be sharing data based upon patient confidentiality and privacy. Very small samples, rare disease, all related in a specific geographic location. So the DMSP will simply claim and justify exemption of sharing this data set. Example two is a larger STD study with self-report data and lab data. Since STDs are reportable diseases, some of the self-report data may lead someone to surmise the identity of the respondent. So in example two, they're going to seriously limit access to and use of the data. And in this case, the final DMP includes proof of protocols to be observed, signed affidavit and access, use, and storage and destruction of the data. Example three is open use, minimal restrictions, public use data set. It's a sample from across the US. Shouldn't need to identify any information at all. And so this is simply a register to download the data, so you can track who's using your data, and a click agreement on use. It is acceptable to state in the DMP that the project is not anticipated to generate data or samples that require management and or sharing. Just remember, if you're going to say something like that, then you need to be able to justify, because your funding agency will look at this and come back to you. And that statement will also be looked at in the peer review process of the grant. If the data you generate is owned by your institution, the data access plan must address the institutional strategy for providing access to relevant data and supporting materials. So again, depending upon your data and who owns it, a larger conversation with the university may be in mind. Open access publishing is not addressed in the implementation of the data management plan requirement. If you plan to do it, again, institutional restrictions and/or provider funding restrictions. If we're going to move and look at selecting a data repository, for some programs and types of data, NIH and/or institute, the center, the office policies, and the funding opportunity announcements will identify particular data repositories or sets of repositories to be used to preserve and share the data. For data generated from research subject to such policies or funded under such FOAs, researchers should use the designated data repositories suggested by the ICO or in the FOA. For data generated from research for which no data repository is specified by NIH or the ICO, researchers are encouraged to select a data repository that is appropriate for the data generated from the research projects that are discipline or data type specific to support effective data discovery and reuse. NIH makes such a list of data repositories. We've listed some here. If there is no appropriate discipline or data type specific repository available, we should consider other potentially suitable data sharing options. These could include small data sets up to about 2 gig in size that can be used as supplementary material to accompany articles submitted to PubMed Central. Data repositories, including the generalist repositories and institutional repositories, make data available to the larger research community, etc. Very, very large data sets are probably going to be best placed in cloud-based repositories for data access, preservation, and sharing. And over to your right, I've included the notice that talks more about data sharing and repositories. When you're looking at post-award data management, because data management goes on until the end of the time you make your data accessible, the general expectation is that data from NIH funded awards that involve human subjects will be submitted for review every 6 months throughout the duration of the award, typically January and July. Awardees provide a data submission agreement signed by the PI and the institutional business official within 6 months of the award. In most cases, a single collection containing data and metadata associated with each grant award is established. Submitting data to this collection is distinct from sharing data with the research community. Submitted data generally is held in a private enclave only open to the awardee until the data are shared with the research community. Data submission does require that data undergo validation and quality checks. Performing these checks improves the reliability and reproducibility of the data. So this is an activity that you'll need to schedule into your grant proposal timeline and management post-award. And you can use the NDA validation tool just to ensure validation of the data. Awardees are also encouraged to submit the full study protocol and the clinical trial protocol, if applicable, as additional information for each collection. Data is shared with the research community when papers using the data have been accepted for publication or at the end of the award period. And that includes the first no-cost extension, should you have a first no-cost extension. Awardees are encouraged to share basic demographic and raw baseline data shortly after data submission to encourage collaborations within the research community. In addition to the regular submission of the data associated with an award, awardees are also expected to separately submit to NDA the specific data that was used for each resulting publication by creating an NDA study. That has a DOI attached to it, and is expected to be included in subsequent publications as a persistent link to the data. Ideally, creation of these studies encourages rigor and reproducibility, which is why this is yet another thing NIH requires. Also, when we're looking at post-award data management, these are the many policies that the may require you to follow. A nice list there. The focus on this is on mental health in IMH. There are similar ones for the other national institutes and centers and offices throughout NIH. In our next section, we're going to look at roles and responsibilities and compliance. And since the DSMP describes how data is going to be managed, you need to specifically state how those responsibilities regarding the management of your data will be delegated. You should outline the staff and organizational roles and responsibilities for implementing the data management plan. It also addresses who will be responsible for data management and monitoring the data management plan. Adherence to the data management plan and how it will be checked or demonstrated. And this is often going to be based upon the granting agency's requirements. Your program officer for the grant will be one who can direct you in that. It identifies the process in place for transferring responsibility for the data. It also identifies who has responsibility over time for decisions about the data once the original personnel are no longer available. A DMSP should include the names of the specific people responsible, their department and division. We're also looking at data preservation and sharing timelines, again, as accessible as possible, no later than the time of an associated publication or the end of performance period, whichever comes first. And researchers are encouraged to consider relevant requirements and expectations as guidance for the minimum time frame that data will be available. So we're looking at data repository policies, award record retention requirements, journal policies. You're submitting your article and a small data set to the journal, or you're referring people back to your data set. How long should that be expected? You need to check with the journal. We also have a number of ethical and legal compliance issues that need to be addressed as well for this sharing of research data. Is your data regulated by policy or law? Are there legal constraints, such as HIPAA, on sharing data? You also need to plan for how data management and sharing will be addressed in your informed consent process. You will need to tell prospective participants how their scientific data are expected to be used and shared. So you need to build that into your planning. You also requires you as a researcher to determine whether access to the data should be controlled with explicit limitations and subsequent use. So participant information remains confidential when the data is shared or made available for secondary analysis. And you will need to address disclosure risk in the data to be shared and archived. So again, data management sharing plan also has implications into the development of the grant proposal, particularly when we're looking at informed consent. We're also looking at other intellectual property rights in the data sets, patents, copyrights involved. If yes, then you have to determine any and all restrictions and conditions to share and disseminate. You may need to have a conversation with general counsel. If someone else owns the data that you're using, what are their conditions for use, sharing, and dissemination? That will need to be built in. And what constraints are required to handle the data and how you comply with these constraints. So for each point you identify, you need to ensure your compliance plan addresses each of those points. Compliance also extends to data repository selection. NIH strongly encourages the use of established repositories to the extent possible for serving and sharing scientific data. And selecting a repository for data resulting from NIH-supported research. Notice, which is on the list of notices, notice OD 21016. helps provide information on selecting a suitable data repository or cloud computing platform. Now we come to the important information about budget, allowable data management sharing costs. You should know that DMSPs can be built into the budget of the grant, so you need to set aside a chunk of change for that. Reasonable allowable costs may cover more than you think. It covers curating data and developing supporting documentation, which includes formatting data according to accepted community standards, the cost to de-identify data, cost of preparing metadata to foster discoverability, interpretation and reuse, costs for formatting data for transmission to and storage at a repository. It also covers local data management considerations, such as creating a unique specialized information infrastructure on site to provide local management preservation before you deposit it into an established repository. And if you want to do a local data management consideration cost, then you need to have a conversation with IT again to see how this will play out. It also covers preserving and sharing data through repositories, such as data deposit fees. So if you're going to propose sharing and preserving your data for 10 years post-award in an established repository, then the cost of that entire 10-year period must be paid prior to the end of the period of performance. If the plan proposes deposition to multiple repositories, you have to include the cost for each proposed repository. That can be included. But again, the full costs of depositing your data into a repository must be budgeted upfront and ready to be paid upfront. It does not include infrastructure costs, including institutional overhead. It does not cover gaining or collecting access to research data, but it covers a lot of things. So when you're looking at what data you're going to make accessible, the format, all the requirements, everything else, think about things you can put in to have done that's allowable under the budget guidelines. And again, this may be something you need to have a conversation with your funder, just to make certain that you're meeting all their needs. And as we're looking at takeaways, a DSMP is more than just a storage locker. It's meant to safeguard data against file corruption of storage media. It includes updating data from obsolete formats. It includes enhanced discovery of and access to your data set. It has a preservation strategy and a disaster recovery plan. It is generally most often handled by third-party archiving or service or data repository. It has to be in compliance with granting agency and university guidelines. It should include the DMSP deposit fees as part of your proposal budget, because you don't want to be hit with a huge amount of stuff at the end on that. I see there's a question from Aaron. I do believe there has been some guidance placed to exclude those costs from the F&A base. I can send those to you after today, Aaron, if you'd like.
Hi, Ardis. Yes, if you could please send us the guidance, we'd appreciate it, because obviously we want to be budgeting appropriately for the February deadlines and everything after that. And if we need to be excluding these costs from the base, that would definitely impact everything. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that, I would greatly appreciate it.
I would be more than happy to share that.
Thank you.
I do not believe that subscriptions to electronic laboratory notebook platforms are an allowable cost, because your lab notebook is not considered part of the scientific data. that needs to be included within an DMSP.
Okay, this is Jerome Breslin. The reason I asked that question is because the electronic laboratory notebooks can create DOIs of the data and fulfill the archiving.
You might want to talk to the program officer or the funder on that when you submit the grant.
Thank
to
you.
see if that's something allowable by them. Because the ICOs have a lot of say in how your data is going to be shared through their grant. And that. So just some takeaways as we're moving through this. So you're in the planning and budgeting phase, you want to make sure that the research is subject to the DMSP policy. You identify your methods, approaches, and repositories. You develop the DMSP. You want to estimate and request funds. During the submission and review phase, you want to submit your plan and budget with a proposal. The peer review considers related budget items. Then NIH program staff review the DMSP plan. The staff may request modifications. And your DMSP will be approved by the funder prior to the award. With or without with modifications if requested. And then the implementing phase, you want to make sure that you're managing your data as described. You'll be providing annual progress reports, and you'll want to consult with your program officer for any changes to your plan.
Hi, I have a question about embargo of the data.
Yes.
You mentioned that the data must be released after first publication. I just want to check on this. So many of us have grants which have multiple different specific aims, and those can be very separate. So are you saying we have to release all the data associated with the grant for the very first publication associated with the grant? Or are you saying we just need to make the data available when that particular data is published?
When that particular data is published for that, at the end of the grant,
yeah,
you will need to make all of your data available within a certain time period after that.
Yes, no, I understand that. I was just checking on the first publication statement that you made. Thank you.
You're welcome. This is just a quick checklist to remember to summarize your data, looking at data type, format, size, and number of files, which data sets will be shared, the level of aggregation, de-identification, processing, or cleaning, the source of any secondary data. Make sure you list your metadata and your other documentation, because as fully as you can describe your data and all the talking points that may come from that data, those may be elements that end up being budgeted for in your DMSP. You're going to make sure you list all the tools, software, and code. There's nothing more irritating than going out and looking at a data set to find out that I need a very specialized product that is no longer made because it's been versioned up and doesn't work with the data that's available. And you want to also identify your standards. So you're going to make sure you have your metadata schema down, control vocabulary, because the better you describe your metadata, the easier it will be for people to find your data to use. It was attached to a publication when you place it out there. Next couple of slides are looking at just resources and a list of the DMSP notices. So I know this was a lot to take in. We'll be sending out the slides, and since it's recorded, we'll send you the recording as well. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send us an email and see what we can do to help.